Well, hello, everybody. This is Michael Norwood, and I'm here today with Dr. Bob Apter. Bob is a new neighbor of mine, and we've been out running a few times together. He's a much better runner than I am, by the way. So I'll say that I'm a much better mountain biker, which is to say he's not a mountain biker at all. But in any case, we've had to stop running because of this whole coronavirus thing. And so we actually haven't done any jogging together, running together for, it's probably been about 5 weeks, wouldn't you say, Bob?
I think it's less than that, but 3 or 4 anyway.
Something like that. Um, and in any case, in the course of our conversations, Dr. Bob has told me about using zinc, which is something that he's done for years personally. Um, just first off, maybe share a little bit about your background. You're an emergency room doctor, and I know you've been doing it for 20, 30, maybe a little longer than that.
Yeah,
Years.
I'm one of the longest practicing emergency physicians you'll find. I've been doing it, I think I'm in my 44th year. I shouldn't say how old I am. But I went part-time about a year and a half ago when the hospital I was working at closed, and it seemed like a good time to go part-time, but I didn't want to quit. So I got a part-time position at a small outlying hospital, which is the kind of setting I prefer. And I'm still doing that. But I'm in a lull right now. So I've had actually a couple of weeks off to try and think of other things. And I've had some time, and I've been pursuing this interest I have in zinc.
Yeah, well, I want you to go into that in depth. I may add as well, you worked as an emergency room doctor. Or was it in the emergency room at Mayo Clinic as well?
I did some part-time work there. It was a temporary position.
Yes.
That was back about 2012.
So first off, without getting overly clinical, let's talk with you just the personal part of it. You know, you work as an emergency room doctor. You're exposed continually to people coming in with different airborne illnesses and other types of illnesses, viruses, bacterial infections, every type of thing. And so tell how you got interested in this to begin with, because it's from personal experience.
Right. My whole journey with this zinc thing is from personal experience, really. And it's always an issue for anybody that works in the emergency departments that we're exposed to colds frequently and influenza. Of course, we're actually required to get annual influenza shots. But back around, 12 or 15 years ago, I think it was now, Zicam first came out as a nasal swab with a zinc gel on it. And they published some studies then, and I looked at studies which I think they had a hand in funding, but they were good studies in my opinion, and really showed a real benefit in aborting colds, making them shorter. It's an idea of using the swab at the very first onset of symptoms, and
So can
then
you just, is Zicam, is that something that's over the counter or tell what
yes,
it
well,
is?
Yes, Zicam, Zicam. The name comes from zinc. It was made by and is still made by a company called Matrix. I forget, Matrix Initiatives, I think is the name of the company. But yes, it's an over-the-counter product. Originally, again, it had zinc in the nasal swabs. It doesn't any longer. What happened in around 2009 was that there were a bunch of anecdotal reports of people losing their sense of smell that they attributed to the zinc nasal swabs. Now, it was never studied. Matrix Initiatives did not agree with this reporting because their initial studies did not turn that up as a side effect when they did their initial evaluation of it. Yet there were a number of anecdotal reports, and then there were some lawsuits, and I think some of this information that was generated about the Zicam zinc swabs causing loss of sense of smell may have really been generated by attorneys fishing for a class action lawsuit. We don't know. It was never studied, but the FDA and they sent out an advisory letter to consumers warning them against the product, and they threatened Matrix Initiatives with sanctions, and Matrix voluntarily withdrew the product from the market. So I don't believe it's technically illegal to sell nasal zinc in the United States, but there are, as far as I know, there have been no products on the market in the United States since that time. And we don't really know if that was a real thing. It became repeated in the medical literature. You'll see people refer to, oh, zinc, intranasal zinc causes a loss of sense of smell or could, but in fact, it was all about that one individual product, Zicam nasal swabs. It was not validated. We don't know if it had to do with that particular formulation. We don't know if it was a real thing. Up until recent reports of loss of sense of smell with coronavirus, probably the most common cause of loss of sense of smell has always been cold viruses. So we don't know if when people experienced that, if it was actually due to the colds, was it due to overuse? We don't know how long it lasted. And we don't know if it was actually a real thing or something just generated by plaintiffs' attorneys for a class action lawsuit. You know, if you put something out there like that to enough people, you're going to say people that say, yeah, I think I lost my sense of smell. Why don't I join in this lawsuit? So we don't really know if that was a real thing.
Right.
It's
So
possible.
for years now, you've been taking what as opposed to Zicam?
Well, so what happened with me personally after that was when they took that off the market, then there was still, and there still is, an oral preparation of zinc available. There's a number of them. You can buy them in the pharmacy if they're not out of stock. Zicam and Cold-EEZE have sold various forms of oral lozenges. Zicam has one they call rapid melts. So I tried those. I have to say they seem to help a little bit, but not nearly as much. I was quite disappointed with the protection I got from colds and using them. And I've reviewed the medical literature since then, and basically the medical literature, I can't find anything really of any significance in terms of studying intranasal zinc in the medical literature. But there is quite a bit about oral zinc for colds. And most of it shows, it's somewhat ambivalent. Most of it shows a small benefit, but not a dramatic benefit. Some studies have shown no benefit. And I think that all mirrors my experience with it. It seems to help a little bit, but nothing like what I experienced with the intranasal zinc.
But you're using a product now that you told me about that's where you haven't had a cold or hardly have had a cold despite being exposed to things for a number of years that you have a
Right,
lot of faith in.
right. So I kind of kept my eye out for a nasal zinc product, and I happened to be going through London back in January of 2013, and I came across this First Defense nasal spray that's spelled DEFENCE, which must be a British spelling. It's an over-the-counter product made under the Vicks brand, so it's made by Procter & Gamble, and it comes from England, or it's marketed in England. So it's not available in pharmacies in the United States, but you can buy it online. Until recently, I would get it from Amazon, but now it's out of stock from
Yeah,
Amazon,
when
so
you
they're
told
not
me about
selling it.
it, I looked it up and was not able to get it.
Right. So I've seen it recently on eBay, and I think you can buy it online directly from various British pharmacies. I think they're still selling it, but it's not as available. I think there's probably a lot of people in England that are trying to use it to protect themselves from the coronavirus.
And what has been your own experience with it? I mean, why you're such an advocate of it, or what you're an advocate of now is you're trying to get a research study done on it because you have no financial interest in this. It's just your own experience has been an excellent experience, which
Right.
I'll have you share.
Right. So I've used the First Defense nasal spray for over 7 years now and been very happy with it in terms of protecting me from colds. I actually am not as careful, or until recently, at protecting myself from people that were coughing and sneezing in the ER, as some of my colleagues would be, because I was always confident in the First Defense protecting me. So if I had somebody cough or sneeze in my face, I would take uh, an inhalation of the First Defense. If I had some other exposure, like traveling on an airplane, I would take a dose. But if I actually come down with a cold, then I would start taking it at the very first onset of symptoms every few hours until 24 hours after the symptoms are gone. So in using it that way, I've found probably a 90% reduction in my morbidity from colds over the last 7 years.
Yeah.
I mean,
If you can describe for people what morbidity is.
yeah, illness. I mean, I used to have frequent colds, and colds are kind of a nuisance for me, but for a lot of people, they're more than a nuisance. They can lead to more serious infections like sinusitis and bronchitis and pneumonia, depending on how susceptible you are. So it's more than just the inconvenience. But for me, the inconvenience has been a big thing. So I will find, for example, that if I'm bothered by the symptoms of a cold, I will take a standard symptomatic cold pill like Dayquil or NyQuil. But in my experience has been in the last 3 years, I've taken 2 pills altogether for colds, other than using the first defense.
Yeah.
So I've been very impressed personally by how it's affected me. And so then I came across a letter written by a virologist pathologist named James Robb, R-O-B-B. It was a letter he wrote to his friends that went viral, but it was about how to protect yourself from coronavirus. And a lot of the advice.
And this was when did he write that letter?
A month or two, a couple of months ago, I think. And a lot of it was fairly standard personal protective recommendations of hand washing and I don't know exactly what he said about masks, but protecting yourself from exposure. But he mentioned oral zinc in there because he mentioned that he was actually a main thrust of his research early in his career was the coronavirus. I believe he was involved in gene sequencing of it. And he particularly noted that coronavirus is sensitive to zinc. And so he recommended in that letter that people use oral zinc. He didn't say anything about nasal zinc. Again, there's this thing in the medical circles in this country that stems back to that FDA thing that suggests that nasal zinc might be harmful to your sense of smell. But I've gone and tried to find any reports of loss of sense of smell that are out there on the internet from this first defense, the product from England that I use, and I can't find any reports. As far as I know, it's not an issue in England where that's sold. So it's a different formulation of zinc, and maybe it just has to do with a less litigious society over there.
Yes.
But it's not been an issue as far as I can determine.
So is this the same one that you sent me a report, and you referenced this report from the NIH, the National Institute of Health, that's at least in their archives. I'm going to read it if you can translate it. My background is as a clinical nutritionist, board certified in it, but it's been a long, long time since I've been in practice. So I'm going to need it translated from Chinese for me as well. Increasing the intracellular zinc-2 concentration with zinc ionospores, like perithione, can efficiently impair the replication of a variety of RNA viruses, including poliovirus and influenza virus. Then they also here, this is related to the coronavirus, the study we demonstrate that the combination of zinc and perithione at low concentrations inhibits the replications of SARS coronavirus. Now, this was a 2010 study. Anyway, if you can talk about that. First, let's just translate a moment. Zinc perithione, that's a specific type of a binding agent or a complex agent used with zinc.
I don't think that study was one that I sent you, or might have gotten forwarded from somebody else. But there was a study about zinc in vitro or coronavirus being sensitive to zinc in vitro, and I think that's pretty accepted in the literature that in terms of in the test tube in the laboratory, coronavirus is sensitive to zinc. But what I'm more interested in is clinical trials. There's a lot of stuff in the laboratory that doesn't necessarily translate into clinical stuff. I mean, we still don't understand really how this coronavirus, this COVID-19 coronavirus, how it's transmitted from person to person. There's been a lot written about how it survives on surfaces, but we don't really know if people are getting it from surfaces or if it's really infective after prolonged periods of times on surfaces. I'm personally somewhat skeptical of that.
Yeah. But it's probably not a bad idea for people to take those protective measures until it's proven otherwise.
Absolutely. But I think there is good evidence that it spreads by aerosolization. one of the
Meaning
things that
when
was
somebody
most
sneezes or when they talk. That
right. Now, early on in the epidemic, I think the CDC was telling us that we should just wear surgical masks to protect from larger droplets, but the very fine droplets that are in aerosols, they aren't blocked by a surgical mask, but they are blocked by an N95 mask. And originally the recommendation was not to use those. Of course, we want to preserve N95 masks for healthcare providers when they're in
what
short
about if you
supply.
have a mask that has like multiple layers of wrapping around it, that it's not just as porous as just a single layer?
Right. I believe that's very helpful. I think an N95
It
mask is
is helpful.
better, but again, we want to save N95 masks for healthcare workers as long as there's a
Yeah.
shortage of them.
Yeah, because you saw the video that I sent out when I went to probably after the last time you and I ran together. I went over to a Home Depot, and being aware of just how viral this thing was and understanding the nature of virality, not so much from my background in healthcare, more from my background in technology. I was shocked that I was the only one in that Home Depot even wearing masks or gloves. Some
Right.
people in the store. However, also being aware that viruses are literally so microscopic that a shirt, or I guess even a mask, that the little pores inside of them are large enough for the virus to easily slip through. But if you wrap something multiple times around, or if you wore multiple masks, not including how it might get through the sides, but at least it's some deterrent. Even if it's just 70 or 80 or 90% deterrent, that's a heck of a lot better than zero deterrent. Am I right with
Right.
that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But whatever you do, if your personal protective gear failed and you started to get a little cold or cold symptoms that you thought might be coronavirus, wouldn't it be nice to be able to make it go away by just taking some inhaled zinc?
Yeah,
I think it
exactly.
would.
And so you're saying that people still can find this on eBay then?
I think so. Last I looked.
And this is in the form of what is the brand name again?
First Defense.
First Defense, and defense spelled with a C at the end.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Well, and you're writing different people trying to promote that a research study be done with first responder workers like yourself. Can you just share just a little bit about that?
Well, I've been kind of disappointed that I haven't had much uptake in my initial contacts with other doctors that I know. I think they're all kind of overwhelmed by the epidemic, or they have other things going on, but it's also maybe difficult to study in the United States because of that FDA advisory. That might make it very difficult to get an investigational review board at an institution to approve it. You don't have a pharmaceutical company that can make a lot of money behind it either, because it's an over-the-counter product. So I'm thinking that it might be easier to get it studied overseas, and I've actually been in touch with an Indian researcher from one of the northern cities in India that has done some publishing on the oral zinc for cold viruses, who's interested in doing a study. So we're talking about that. I'm hoping that something gets done, but it takes time to get studies done.
Yes.
But it won't happen unless somebody starts it. So I'm very interested in clinical studies. It's one thing to say it works in a test tube, but it's another thing to show that it works in people. Same thing is going on with so many of the drugs.
The name of my channel is Speaking Your Truth with Michael. And so, besides just feeling an obligation that this, with the danger and the pandemic nature of the coronavirus, that anything that can be done, that possibly done without necessarily knowing 100% for sure, but at least anecdotally through your own experience, a veteran ER doctor, so besides wanting to release that information, I think it's very noble that you're coming forth, and I don't know if you've got to suffer the slings and arrows, as Shakespeare would say, of others, but certainly the skepticism of other people in the medical establishment, especially when they're so overwhelmed. So can you just speak about that just a moment, as far as your own the gumption that it takes to keep moving ahead and trying to get that research done?
Well, I think my wife is very scared that I'm going to arouse the ire of people I work for or with or whatever, but I guess I'm willing to take that risk. I've posted a few things on an emergency physician discussion website about coronavirus that has actually hundreds of threads on it. And I've been surprised at the relative lack of response. There's really not been anybody on that website that's wanted to engage in a public discussion of studying this. I've gotten a few responses of, yeah, I've used Zinc and it works, and I've really, I think it's great. And I've gotten a few responses of, that's interesting, how do I get it? But nobody really wants to talk about getting a study done in
Yeah.
the people I've talked to yet, other than this doctor in India that I've been corresponding with.
Well,
I
I
wish I
guess
could make
sometimes,
some I wish I could make some contact with some British emergency physicians or researchers, and I just haven't figured out a way to do that at this point.
well, maybe putting this video out there will help that word get spread, and you'll be able to not get your wish, but literally get something that could really help a lot of people. And at the very least, the people who hear this may have another option in their own personal defense and protecting themselves with coronavirus, especially now that, with this talk of us going back to calling off the lockdown. What's your thoughts on that? Is the president being too preemptive with this? And obviously he's got to be concerned about the economy. There's a lot of factors, but from a medical perspective, from a viral perspective, a month, what does that seem like to you?
Well, we're not ready yet. I think that's clear, but it's really hard to know. We're feeling our way with this virus. Everything is new about it. We really don't know. We know that some people shed the virus for a long time, but we don't know that they're infective. One of the things that I found most interesting in what's been reported was this experience with the corral in Skagit County, Washington, which I may have mentioned to you. That's where I spent most of my adult life, and I still have a home up there that I'm at some of the time, not very often. But in Skagit County, they had this choral group that met March 10th. And March 10th in Washington, the coronavirus had been identified in the county south. That's where the very first US case was identified. And further south in Seattle, they had the problem with the nursing home in Kirkland, and there were a number of cases. But as of March 10th, there had been no cases reported in Skagit County. So 60 people in this choral group decided that they would go ahead and have a practice, knowing that there might be some risk. But they were all offered hand sanitizers at the door. They made an effort not to shake hands, not to hug, to do some social distancing. And nobody there was sick. Nobody had a cough. Nobody was sneezing. So they practiced singing for 2 hours. And out of those 60 people, 45 became ill. I think 28 were confirmed coronavirus, and 17 were sick with a similar illness and weren't tested, and 2 died. But 45 out of 60 is just an enormous attack rate for an infectious disease. So in my mind, that's strong evidence that this is spread by aerosolization. And I think that's likely the primary way it's spread. So probably singing is a more forceful way to expel this aerosol than normal talking or breathing. I suspect that the infectivity is highest with singing and next with talking and less with breathing. But I suspect it's spread through the air much more than it is through any other way. Now, it may be spread by surfaces, but I haven't seen anything else that demonstrates that spread in such a convincing way. I've seen a comment from one infectious disease specialist that, for example, about packages. Well, if it was spread on packages, then it would have spread immediately throughout the world from China early on in the epidemic, and it didn't. So I don't think there's good evidence of it being spread that way. Now, I think...
Let me ask you from just a very practical perspective, if through excuse my lack of pronunciation.
Aerosolization.
So if some of the droplets gets on a surface and somebody touches that surface, obviously that's less of an immediate transmitter than receiving a full dose of, through somebody either sneezing in your face, coughing, or just breathing in the air who's infected with the virus. But isn't that just as viable if it's on a surface and somebody touches it, then they touch their own face, or particularly their nose, or one of the areas where there's any sort of mucosal surfaces?
But we just don't know is the answer. And certainly the portal of entry for the virus is the mouth and nose, and probably to a lesser extent the eyes. So I think the thing that's most important to do is frequent hand washing and hand sanitization, because that's going to help protect you, and then avoiding touching your face. So some people argue that the most important thing a mask does is keep you from touching your face. And it's certainly part of it.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Dr. Bob. And so the bottom line is that zinc in reasonable dosages is not at all harmful. In higher dosages, it can cause nausea and things like that. But generally speaking, it's a safe alternative, even though we don't know what the efficacy is of it. But certainly anybody out there who hears this, who knows anybody who's involved in the research community, this is certainly worthwhile to share with others. So
I would certainly agree with that. And if anybody out there can put me in touch with somebody that might be able to do a clinical study on this, I think that could have tremendous consequences if we were able to do a double-blind clinical study and show benefit and show that benefit outweighed any potential side effects. I think it has the potential to be a tremendous intervention in this epidemic.
Excellent. Well, hopefully we'll get the word out there, and that's exactly what will happen. Thank you once again, Dr. Bob.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael.
Okay. All right. So I stopped